Move forward a few more years, and it was around this time they begin to push for and demand more acceptance, as well as more of a say in what they are now claiming is still their country. At first, small things were offered, like French on postage stamps in 1927, and then French on the Canadian money in 1936, and then the big one. With Trudeau having the ear of the then Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson, he convinced Pearson that something needed to be done to appease the ever-increasing French demands in order to maintain a unified country. So the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism was established, which worked from 1963 through to 1970 and subsequently produced its reports. At that point, Canada saw the advent of the OLA, or the Official Languages Act.
The authority for Trudeau and his new team was to make French Canadians feel more at home with the federal government. A new Official Languages Act.
Shortly after he came to power, the Consumer Packaging and Labeling Act was born in 1974, along with regulations respecting bilingual labeling of all consumer products. The whole time, the British, English, just kept accommodating and accepting the accumulation of more and more French saturation in more and more areas. All of this was viewed by the English as a positive step towards coexistence and harmony, but unbeknownst to the English, the French had a different interpretation of things. They saw the English as weak and willing to give in on any of their demands. Call it a culturally different way of looking at things, as this is likely the root of what it really was.
The Parti Québécois signals an end to bilingualism in Quebec.
Okay, but out of this, how do we end up with French first on recordings that people hear when they call in from other countries?
Faites le 1 ou le 0 ainsi que l'indicatif régional avant le numéro que vous désirez joindre. Il s'agit d'un appel interurbain. C'était un message enregistré. This is a long-distance call. Please dial 1 or 0 as well as the area code for the number you are calling. This is a recording.
And also, what about the French-dominant federal websites? How can that be if Canada is a British land that has a majority English-speaking population? I mean, considering, like you said, we're dealing with a tiny 17.5% of the total Canadian population, of which approximately 90% of that 17.5% live within the two mostly French provinces of Quebec and New Brunswick.
Well, the whole thing is actually based on a huge deception and a ploy carried out over many decades by a very powerful man and his clan. Trudeau was a man who was very closely connected to his French roots.
Trudeau himself had said, however, that if he were not a French Canadian by birth, he would be one by adoption.
And he truly believed that Canada should still belong to the French. For that matter, he believed it should never have changed hands in the first place. And despite France having signed a declaration which handed Canada over to the British, he didn't accept this as how things should be. It was a thorn in his side, and he set out to recapture Canada. He was actually often quite clear about his intentions when he spoke as well.
Be master in your own house, he told the Quebecois, but let that house be all of Canada.
But since it could be interpreted differently by either side, he got away with it. Since he was a very coy and strategic thinking kind of man, he also realized that literally fighting to recapture Canada for the French at this time in history was out of the question. His plan also took into account the idea that if he moved too quickly, the English would catch on to what was happening and likely resist to some degree. So he decided the only other way to accomplish his dream of the French ruling and controlling this country in a way he believed they always should have was through the use of a long-term strategic approach. The age-old concept whereby you chip away at something with such small strokes that the gradual changes are imperceptible until it's too late. To his credit, I'm sure he realized this strategy would take decades to come to fruition. He probably even understood that the final blows were likely to only begin to really show any form of real success long after his death, but he accepted that certainty with the belief that his plan would ultimately work and his clan could once again rule Canada. The plan. Throughout his reign as leader of Canada, he was heard to say and seen to do many things that were perceived by the general population of Canada as being a strong federal voice against the French. But Because of how he worded things, there was often much misinterpretation surrounding what he said and did.
In English Canada, Trudeau was widely seen as someone who was going to put Quebec in its place.
Well, I am trying to put Quebec in its place, and the place of Quebec is in Canada, nowhere else.
As a matter of fact, many things were even misinterpreted by the French separatists who misread Trudeau's seemingly strong federal stance as him being against the French in some way, which of course, for those who understood exactly what he was up to, this kind of accusation was totally absurd.
But it was a terrible misinterpretation of what he was going to do.
He saw the future of French Canada and Quebec essentially in federal institutions.
As a matter of fact, many French purists hated Pierre Trudeau, as many still do today, and because his son Justin is following along the same plan, he tends to garner the same wrath of hardcore French separatist hate as well.
Doing so, he come in and insult René Lévesque, insult the memory of this very sad moment for Quebec history. That's just a nonsense.
Of course, all of this helps them with the unilingual English majority vote because they see it as them being strong against the French, which it is not the case at all. If one listens carefully, the nuances spoken between the lines is steeped in the ideal of a pure and ultimate French-dominant Canada, where it's perfectly fine for the province of Quebec to have laws outlawing the English language, and the federal government must spend billions turning unilingual English Canadians into bilingual ones who can be subordinates to the up-and-coming pure French race. If one views all of those early statements and actions through this prism, then it becomes clear that Trudeau's actual strategy was clearly a case of him not wanting the French to think small and end up with just the province of Quebec as their reward. He wanted to offer them the bigger, more illustrious gift of a return to power over all of Canada. As you see in this now infamous speech, while speaking to the French, his clan, he blatantly tells the whole of the Canadian public on Canadian television that they, the French, should be in control of this country.
He was in Montreal. Be master in your own house, he told the Quebecois, but let that house be all of Canada.
Interestingly enough, his son Justin basically said the same thing many years later. Again, speaking in French to one of his own French clan, he says, "We, the French, have a role in this country. Canada belongs to us."
Alors, on a un rôle, ce pays, le Canada, est à nous.
That was often the case in Trudeau Sr.'s public speeches. Behind the we and the our was the fact that he included himself on the side of his own clan, as in, we the French should be able to speak to our own government in our own language.
We can't even speak our own language. We go to Ottawa, we met at the door of Parliament, we want to see our Member of Parliament.
Our courage is strong, and our dreams for this beautiful country will never die.